Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Sci-Fi Christian Screening Room. I'm Ben DeBono, and today I'm going to be introducing the third film we'll be watching in this series, Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory. Now, before I get into kind of what I've tried to typically do in these first couple introductions of giving you 3 things to watch for in this film that then Ben and I will discuss when we do our review, I want to kind of talk about where Paths of Glory fits in Stanley Kubrick's body of work, because I actually think it's one of the more interesting pieces of his filmography in that sense. It's not his best film, though I do think it's a great movie. I think it's a masterpiece, actually. But it is, in some ways, one of the most important movies in terms of making Stanley Kubrick who he eventually became. So, Paths of Glory was his 4th movie that he did. The first 2, Fear and Desire and Killer's Kiss, are movies that, if you're really into Stanley Kubrick, are worth checking out so you can kind of get a feel for where he came from and how he developed and all that. But other than that, they're just not very good movies. Especially Fear and Desire. It's made really cheap, and you can see hints of some of the themes that he would explore later on. But it's not a great movie. The third movie he did, The Killing, is actually really good. It's not a great movie. It has some flaws, but it's an enormous leap forward, and it showed that he was a director that you needed to pay attention to. Paths of Glory, his 4th film, was the one that, in my opinion, really put him on the map. That was the one that said, this guy is not just another run-of-the-mill director, which The Killing suggested. He's somebody who is going to be doing some really special work and is worth paying attention to. It also helped to get him in with Kirk Douglas, who would become instrumental in developing him with Spartacus, which we'll talk about in a second, kind of that double-edged sword, which would get him into the studio system and eventually show that he was a bankable director. So very important in that sense. It represents an enormous leap forward from that early work, especially those first 2 films. But it's also important when we look at the 2 films that came after it. So Paths of Glory was followed by Lolita and Spartacus, 2 films that Stanley Kubrick readily admits are compromised in his filmography. Now, not nearly to the same degree. I think Lolita is a very, very good film, and I think Spartacus is a disaster in many ways. It's okay in parts, but it's not a good movie at all. Lolita was compromised by censors. It was very controversial material, and Stanley Kubrick gave into pressure to kind of tone down some of the elements in there and imply things more than he wanted to. The result is a film that, again, I think is excellent in many ways, but that he himself admits is maybe more compromised in that area than he wishes it would have been. Spartacus, then, is his first, or is really his only director for hire credit. So with Spartacus, he replaced the director who was originally on the set for the first couple weeks of filming. He did not have total control, and as a result, he later disowned the film. He was fighting with Michael Douglas, Kirk Douglas, and Douglas Trumbo, the screenwriter, throughout the whole thing. He has described that film later as being an exercise in making bad material interesting, so he had a fairly low opinion of it. That one, along with his first 2 films, Fear and Desire and Killer's Kiss, were the only movies that Stanley Kubrick ever disowned. However, Spartacus, for all of its flaws, played a very important role in Kubrick's development, because it showed him that combined with the experience on Lolita showed him that he needed to have complete control over a movie in order to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. But in my opinion, what I would argue is that if it wasn't for Paths of Glory, he wouldn't have been able to get that control. Now, he was able to get that from every film on, from Dr. Strangelove, which was his next movie after Spartacus, all the way to Eyes Wide Shut. Stanley Kubrick had total control of his films. But he wouldn't have been able to get that, in my opinion, if he hadn't been able to show just how good he was with Paths of Glory. So it was the combination of Paths of Glory along with the frustrations and compromises of Lolita and Spartacus that ultimately made Stanley Kubrick who he is. Now, even on its own, though, it's just a fantastic film, even without taking into account the influence on his later work. This is a great movie. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a war movie. It's set during World War I, and that's actually where I want to start in terms of the three things that you need to look for. The first is that it is set in World War I. And there aren't a lot of movies that are these days. Obviously, there's a handful that come out, but World War I is kind of the forgotten war. It's overshadowed by World War II, certainly in terms of cinematic attention to it. Even if you saw Wonder Woman earlier this year, which I personally was not a big fan of, but I know a lot of people were, but I think even people who were fans of it can kind of recognize that that movie sort of took the Germans in World War I and treated them as though they were Nazis. There weren't swastikas, but just about everything else. It essentially was trying to do World War II politics in a World War I setting. So even when World War I manages to show up in a big movie like that, it's overshadowed by World War II. Not the case in Paths of Glory. Paths of Glory is purely about World War I. It is about the politics of World War I in terms of the control of generals and all of that. You don't have to have a good grasp of World War I history to appreciate this movie, but if you do, a lot of that is going to show up. I think it also captures the spirit of the trench warfare that was taking place in World War I in a way that I've never found equaled in any other World War I movie I've seen. In fact, going back to Wonder Woman in a second, the scene that everybody loved where she gets out of the trench and kind of charges through the enemy lines, I actually hated that scene, and I hated it because of Paths of Glory, because I felt like Paths of Glory really changed the way that I viewed World War I and that trench warfare, and made it so that when I watched Wonder Woman, I felt like they were belittling something by making it so that she could just charge right through everybody. I felt like, in my opinion, nobody agrees with me on this, so don't worry if you don't either, but in my opinion, that belittled something that shouldn't have been belittled. Okay, so nobody agrees with me on that, but what you can get out of this movie is a good appreciation for World War I, an appreciation for an area in history that is, unfortunately, too often overshadowed in cinema. Okay, number two and three will both relate more to Stanley Kubrick. Number two is related to the film's cinematography. This is a movie where if you ever want to understand why cinema is primarily a visual art form, pay attention during Paths of Glory. Okay? This is a movie where you could hit mute through the entire thing, and simply by paying attention to the way that scenes are shot, the backgrounds of different characters, you would be able to grasp the themes that Stanley Kubrick is trying to get across, namely the experience of the generals and the politicians and their ornate palaces, as opposed to the expendable lives of the soldiers who are in the muck and the dirt in the trenches. It's a phenomenal contrast, and it's all done through cinematography. The film never preaches at you because its message is purely done through the visual. It's a fantastic way of showing the way cinema can communicate in a way that no other medium can. In some ways, this is a precursor to Barry Lyndon, Kubrick's later film, and in my opinion, the second best one he ever did after 2001. Barry Lyndon is also a film that really gets across almost everything by visual storytelling, though even to a greater degree in that case. Now, a lot of people struggle with Barry Lyndon, and I think that if you've seen Barry Lyndon and you didn't quite get that, Paths of Glory is another good one to start with. It's far more accessible than Barry Lyndon. It's much shorter, for one thing, but it also helps you to kind of understand the way Kubrick approaches visual storytelling, and I think you can watch this film, learn from it what he's doing, and then go back to a movie like Barry Lyndon and really appreciate it much more because of what this film is able to communicate. All right, and then number three is that this film is a great argument for Stanley Kubrick, the humanist. So a lot of times Stanley Kubrick is accused of being overly cold and logical and intellectual in regards to his films and not really caring about the human element. If you've ever read Stephen King's critiques of The Shining, that's maybe one of the most predominant examples of that type of criticism against Stanley Kubrick's films. Now, if you only look at the surface of a Stanley Kubrick movie, it's easy to understand why somebody would come to that conclusion. I happen to think that conclusion is completely wrong, and part of why I think it's wrong is because Stanley Kubrick's movies have this strong humanist element to them, and I think this really shines through in Paths of Glory. This is an anti-war film, but it's not an anti-war film because it's arguing the concept of war. It's an anti-war film because it's looking at the human cost of war, and that's a key difference in my mind. If Stanley Kubrick was this detached intellectual that people like to claim he was, then Paths of Glory would be a film that argues against war in the abstract, argues against war as an idea. It is not. Instead, what it does is it argues against the effects of war on the humans who are caught up in it. And that's found so well in the closing scene, which I'm not going to ruin for you if you haven't seen it, but you'll know it when you see it. It's a fantastic way to close out the movie on a wonderfully human note. It's one of my favorite parts of the movie. So those are your three things to watch for in Paths of Glory. Look for the World War I elements and appreciate that, a rarely visited period of history in cinema. Look for the visual storytelling and see the humanist elements in it. Now, I'm not quite sure yet when Ben and I are going to be recording our review. He and his wife just had their second child, so obviously things are a little in flux there. We'll just see what his schedule shakes out to here over the next 2 weeks. But I think by the end of the month here, we're about mid-November right now. And I think around the end of the month or so, we'll probably get the next episode out. So, until then, go search out Paths of Glory, give it a watch, give it a rewatch. It's a great movie. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I can't wait to show it to Ben and to talk about it with you guys more on our review episode. So, that's all for now. This is Ben DiBono. Goodbye.